is that I recall when I was a kid, when I went to university, I was instructed, I was at my alma mater this past weekend, Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, and I remembered an English professor of mine, Harry Schultz. Harry Schultz had been captured by the Germans during the Second World War and spent half of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. Well, I was instructed by a man who'd suffered war. My parents' generation understood the Depression. When the Soviet Union reared up, people I worked for, first George H.W. Bush, who had fought in the Second World War and been shot down and plucked out of the water by a U.S. submarine as the Japanese were making plans to get him. And then, of course, I worked for Ronald Reagan. Reagan had bad eyesight, so he didn't serve in combat, but he again served in the Second World War. These were, I don't know, John, you tell me about this, but these were grown-ups. That whole generation had known suffering. They knew when things went wrong that they could go very wrong, that this was a serious business, that politics was serious. It wasn't a game. And also, I think of this as well, the journalists. I don't know if these names, but Walter Cronkite, who was perhaps the most famous news broadcaster in the 80s when I was in the White House, CBS News, Walter Cronkite, the evening broadcast. Walter Cronkite flew with troops in a glider, flew with American troops as part of the Normandy invasion so that he could report on. He risked for journalism. That's a lot different. That's just, so it almost feels as though, what is it, that each generation, we're good for 2 or 3 generations, and then we have to, and then a generation has to experience for itself what is at stake. It has to make that discovery itself. Now, that is not a good way to go about business, but I'm beginning to think that it's necessary. And I will now submit that possibility to you. What do you think?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for it. My own father almost lost his life, wasn't expected to live in the Middle East, the battle against Rommel, which of course was the first turning point for the Allies during the Second World War in the end. The famous 9th
Under Montgomery,
Division.
How did the Australians serve in those days? Where was he?
He was in the Middle East. Montgomery came later. 3 Australian divisions went to the Middle East. 2 came home when Japan entered the war, were brought home. 1 was left there. And Rommel himself regarded them as the most effective fighters of all, the Australian 9th Division. But so I grew up, in a sense, in the shadow of war because my father had been through it. And he never played the victim, but he could have, which is an interesting reflection, on the way in which now so many people who have, I'm sorry to say it, relatively little to complain of, now see themselves to be terrible victims. There are terrible victims, but a lot of the people who claim to be victims have a great deal more to be thankful for than to claim victimhood over, in my view. So I do think there's some truth to a lot of truth you'll say. I mean, I think you Americans have an expression, the greatest generation. They say they went through wars, they went through depressions, they went through the Cold War. They saw the utter horror of the gas chambers, when all of that was revealed, and they understood that the dividing line between a good outcome and an evil one is very finely balanced indeed. And it depends upon us recognising our own capabilities for doing horrendous things. That's all washed out now in a surge of self-righteousness that seems to me to be unbelievable. And these things are in the balance in terms of, I think, where we go as a culture. I deeply and genuinely believe that's why I do what I do now. I mean, I could just sort of retire away, as many people I'm sure would like me to do, and vegetate away as a farmer. But can I come back to where America goes now? Because the American people have not given the incoming regime a blank check. They haven't done that. We've already said one of the great problems seems to be, because we've got this in our country too, the lack of humility on the part of those who should say, wow, we thought we were going to cream it in. We thought we had the people with us. Well, mind you, a lot of them don't really believe in democracy. A lot of modern elites and technocrats. We always have to have elites. There are always leaders. You just want to make sure you get the right leaders and the right technocrats, I suppose you'd say. And they're people who believe in the worth and the dignity of ordinary citizens. Today's elites seem to believe less and less in that. I don't know that they'll be asking themselves the right questions. Why have we not been given carte blanche to do the things that we said we were going to do? I reckon the incoming president, assuming that's the right terminology to use about Mr. Biden, he's probably the man hoping most of all, is he not, that the Republicans control the Senate. It might help him fight off some of the really extreme views of those in his own team.
Yes, Joe. The polls predicted, and the mainstream media were only too happy to trumpet the polls, a blue wave, that the Democrats would not only take the White House, but they'd sweep the Senate and sweep the House of Representatives. They'd recapture control of the Senate and increase their majority in the House. And they won the White House. It now appears there are disputes and legal action still taking place, but I personally haven't read it as closely as perhaps I should, but it doesn't look to me as though it's going to be possible. There were irregularities, fraud around the edges. There, in any election where over 100 million votes get cast, you can expect some of that. I don't see how the result could be overturned. Set that aside. The Senate, Republicans have not, the Senate now, there are 50, that's right, it's 50 to 48. Republicans now hold 50, Democrats hold 48. There are 2 seats to be decided in Georgia yet. Georgia, like 2 or 3 other southern states, has a runoff rule such that if no candidate wins over 50% in the first round election, they'll hold a special runoff election. And in this case, I believe they set the date now for for January 4th. And the final 2 seats in the Senate will be decided in Georgia. It seems to me clear that the Republicans will win at least one of those. Probably, if I had to put money on it, come to think of it, I might put money on it. There's a new site I've discovered that I might do a bit. I may try to earn a few quid off that one. But the Republicans will remain in control, narrowly in control, but will remain in control in the Senate. In some ways, an even bigger story has been the House of Representatives, where there are still something like 10 seats that are undecided. Republicans lead very narrowly in at least 5 of those seats, and they've already picked up 8 seats. So the Democratic majority in the House has shrunk when they were expecting it to expand. So every grown-up in the Democratic Party is saying, well, now wait a moment. Looks as though we got rid of Trump, but we don't have the Senate, and our majority in the House is so narrow that on any major piece of legislation, if we lose 10 or a dozen or 15 votes to the Republicans, bear in mind, of course, that we're talking about a chamber with 435 members. Losing 10 or 15 members on a vote is not at all an unusual thing. Then we, the Democrats, would lose that vote. So Joe Biden, I was about to say Joe Biden is hemmed in. Here's the correct way to put it. The basic institutions of the Republic remain safe for at least a few more years. Biden is not going to come under realistic pressure to pack the Supreme Court because he could never get that through the Senate. He's not going to come under, in the Senate itself, they're not going to eliminate the filibuster because the Republicans won't have it. My concern was that if there was a so-called blue wave, if morale among the Democrats was very high because they'd expanded the majority in the House, recaptured the Senate, then Biden would be unable to resist the left wing of the party, and the Democrats would make permanent changes to the basic structures. They'd pack the court, the Supreme Court. They'd eliminate the filibuster. They bring in Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia as states and add four essentially permanently Democratic seats to the Senate. That, to my mind, that was the real risk that the left of the Democratic Party wanted to. They were the ones who wanted an end to history. They wanted an end state of American politics that left them permanently in charge. That won't happen because the American voters won't have it.
Yeah, well, in the end, it does come back to this willingness to listen to what the voters are really saying. That should be incumbent upon all political leaders, and no longer seems to be. I know in our country there are certainly those who think the voters get it wrong. We know better. so we'll find ways to circumvent their wishes. Now that really is a very patronising, very proud, a very inappropriate and a very unwise stance to take, but it's quite widespread. But I want to come, and it feeds into my next question. I'd just be interested in your feelings on this. You've mentioned that, the pollsters got it wrong. Everybody's talking about that. They got Brexit wrong. They got the last Australian election wrong. They got 2016 wrong. They certainly got this one wrong. Everyone's down on the pollsters. But there's a part of me that's saying, no, hang on, there's another deeper question that ought to be asked here by the elites. Why are people not telling the pollsters what they really think? Doesn't it say something profound about the way in which people are now feeling obliged to say things that they don't believe to be true, and even to contradict their own conscience?
Yes, absolutely right. Absolutely right. It reminds me, I went to a talk, this must be something like at least 15 years ago. It was before the political correctness became as virulent as you just suggested it has now become. Nathan Sharansky had a new book out. This is the thing. He was a Jewish refusenik and spent many years in prison in the Soviet Union, and now he's a prominent parliamentarian in Israel. He had a new book out. He was speaking here at the Stanford campus, and he said that if you wanted to sum up the Soviet existence, that was what it came to. That you were forced to repeat lies. You were forced in public to say things that you knew to be untrue. In your family, when you're absolutely certain you were among yourselves, you could tell the truth. But in school, in the workplace, in a store, in the street, you had to say things that you knew were untrue. And that was deeply corrosive of the human spirit. Now, we're not the Soviet Union, but people feel intimidated. Ordinary Americans feel intimidated. I was talking to a friend who said 4 years ago, here in Northern California, which is a liberal part of the country, he wouldn't put a Trump poster in his yard, Trump for president placard in his front yard because he was afraid it would get stolen. Here we are 4 years later. This time he and his wife wouldn't do it because they were afraid somebody would throw a brick through their window. That increase in the level of intimidation that people feel. And again, this is why Trump got 9 more million votes this time around than he did 4 years ago. But yes, I agree completely. That's the canary in the coal mine in American politics, that people don't feel at liberty to tell pollsters what they really think.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.